There comes a moment in life, a quiet, defining moment, when you finally put down the weight you were never meant to carry. Not with anger, not with drama, but with clarity. You stop chasing, and in that moment something powerful begins to shift. Because chasing isn't love. Chasing is fear disguised as effort. It's the belief that if you just try a little harder, say a little more, give a little extra, you can finally be chosen. But here's the truth most people don't realize. The more you chase someone who is emotionally unavailable, the more you train them to value distance over connection. You become predictable. You become safe. And in their world, safety doesn't inspire action. It invites complacency. But the day you stop, that's the day everything changes. Because your absence does something your presence never could. It interrupts their pattern. You see, an avoidant doesn't respond to pressure. They retreat from it. But when the pressure disappears, when the constant reassurance, the constant reaching, the constant reassurance, the constant reaching, the constant availability is gone, now there's space. Space for them to think, space for them to feel, space for them to wonder, why aren't they here anymore? Why did they stop? Did I lose something real? And for the first time, they sit with the silence you used to fill. But this isn't about making them miss you. This is about you finally remembering yourself. Because when you stop chasing, you're not just stepping back from them, you're stepping back into your power. You're saying, I will not beg for what should be freely given. I will not prove my worth to someone who refuses to see it. I will not abandon myself just to keep someone else comfortable. And that energy, that quiet, grounded certainty is magnetic, not because it manipulates, but because it reflects truth. The truth that you are whole, with or without them. And here's the paradox. The moment you stop trying to convince someone of your value is often the moment they begin to question why they ever doubted it. But by then, something inside you has changed. You're no longer waiting. You're no longer hoping. You're no longer chasing. You've become the person who understands that love is not something you earn. It's something you allow. And if someone cannot meet you there, you let them go. Not because you don't care, but because you finally care about yourself more. So if you're standing at that edge right now, tired, exhausted, wondering if you should keep trying, let this be your permission to stop. Not as a strategy, not as a game, but as a decision to choose peace over anxiety, clarity over confusion, self-worth over uncertainty, because the day you stop chasing is the day you start attracting something real. And whether they come back or not, you will have already found something far more important, you. Chasing creates an invisible imbalance that slowly erodes your sense of self, even if you don't recognize it at first. It feels like effort, like care, like devotion, but beneath the surface, it quietly sends a message. My value is something I need to prove. And the moment you step into that energy, the dynamic between you and the other person begins to shift in a way that rarely works in your favor. When you chase, you are constantly reaching outward for validation. Instead of standing firmly in your own worth, you begin to overextend, sending the extra message, making the extra effort, forgiving the inconsistency, justifying their distance. You tell yourself it's because you care deeply. But what's really happening is that you are negotiating your value in real time. You are showing someone that your attention, your time, and your emotional investment are all flexible, all available, or willing to bend. And people don't always respond to that with gratitude. More often, they respond to it with comfort. They relax into the idea that you will always be there, no matter how little they give in return. Not because they are cruel or intentionally manipulative, but because human nature adapts to the level of effort required. When something is always accessible, always chasing, always proving itself, it stops being something that needs to be pursued. This is where the imbalance deepens. You start giving more, hoping it will inspire them to match you. But instead, it creates a widening gap where your effort increases and theirs decreases. You become the one holding the connection together, while they become the one deciding when and how to engage. And without realizing it, you've handed over the power in the relationship. What makes this even more dangerous is how subtle it is. It doesn't feel like you're losing yourself. It feels like you're trying. It feels like you're showing up. But there's a difference between showing up from a place of wholeness and showing up from a place of fear. One says, I choose to be here. The other says, I need to be here so I don't lose this. And that need, the underlying urgency, is what communicates that your value is negotiable. Because when you truly believe in your worth, you don't feel the need to convince someone of it. You don't feel the need to chase clarity, chase attention, chase consistency. You expect those things as a natural part of any meaningful connection. But when you chase, you lower those expectations in real time. You accept less, hoping it will eventually turn into more. And the other person feels that. Even if they can't articulate it, they sense that the dynamic is tilted. They sense that you are more invested, more available, more willing to hold on. And that awareness, conscious or not, changes how they show up. It allows them to stay in their comfort zone, to give only what feels easy, because they know you will compensate for the rest. This is why chasing rarely leads to the outcome you want. Not because you're not enough, but because the behavior itself undermines the very thing you're trying to build. It teaches the other person that they don't have to rise to meet you. You will simply lower yourself to meet them. And over time, that takes a toll. Not just on the connection, but on you. You start to feel drained, confused, and uncertain. You question your worth, wondering why your effort isn't being reciprocated. But the answer isn't that you need to give more, it's that you were never meant to prove your value in the first place. The moment you stop treating your worth as something that needs to be earned through effort, everything begins to realign. Because real connection doesn't grow from imbalance. It grows from mutual recognition, where both people stand in their value, not chase after it. There is a quiet paradox at the heart of avoidant behavior. They are comfortable with distance, but they are not comfortable with true absence. Distance allows them to maintain control. It gives them room to breathe, to stay emotionally protected, to engage on their own terms without feeling overwhelmed. But absence, real, undeniable absence, removes that control entirely, and that's where something deeper begins to stir within them. When you are consistently present in their life, even if they keep you at arm's length, you become part of their emotional landscape. They may not fully invest, they may not always show up the way you need, but they know you're there. Your messages, your effort, your patience, these things create a steady background presence, and ironically, that presence allows them to remain avoidant, because they never have to confront the possibility of losing you. Distance, in this sense, becomes their comfort zone. It's the perfect balance for them, close enough to feel a connection, but far enough to avoid vulnerability. They can dip in and out, engage when it suits them, retreat when it doesn't, all while knowing the connection is still intact. There's no urgency, no real consequence. No moment that forces them to reflect on what you truly mean to them. But when that presence disappears, when you stop reaching out, stop filling the silence, stop maintaining the connection for both of you, something shifts in a way they cannot ignore. Because absence is not just distance multiplied. Absence is final in a way distance is not. It removes the predictability they relied on. It takes away the reassurance that you will always be there, waiting, understanding, patient. And without that reassurance, they are left alone with their own thoughts. This is where the discomfort begins. Not because they suddenly become someone else overnight, but because the dynamic they were used to is gone. They can no longer take the connection for granted. They can no longer assume that you will bridge the gap. And for someone who is used to control, the pace and depth of a relationship, that loss of control can feel deeply unsettling. In that space, questions start to arise, questions that never had room to exist before. What happened? Why did they stop? Were they more important to me than I realized? These questions don't come from pressure. They come from the absence of it. And that's what makes them powerful, because for the first time, they are not reacting to your effort. They are responding to your lack of it. You see, avoidants are not immune to feeling. They are simply skilled at suppressing or delaying it. As long as the connection exists in a controlled, distant way, they can keep those feelings at bay. But when the connection is no longer there to manage, those emotions don't disappear. They surface. And suddenly the distance that once felt comfortable begins to feel empty. This doesn't mean they will immediately rush back or suddenly become emotionally available. But it does mean they are now in a space where reflection is possible. A space where they can no longer rely on you to carry the emotional weight of the connection. A space where they have to confront what your absence actually means. And that confrontation is something distance alone could never create. Because distance allows them to stay disconnected while still feeling secure. Absence removes that security. It forces them to experience the reality of what life feels like without you in it. Not as a theory, not as a distant possibility, but as a present truth. And in that truth, something begins to shift. Not because you tried harder, but because you finally stopped. Your silence does something your words never could. It removes the emotional safety net they didn't even realize they were relying on. When you are the one consistently reaching out, checking in, initiating, and maintaining the connection, you become a form of reassurance in their life. Even if they don't fully meet you, even if they remain distant or inconsistent, they know on some level that you are there. And that knowledge creates a kind of quiet comfort for them. It's not always conscious. They may not sit there thinking, I can act this way because they won't leave. But their behavior reflects that belief. They take longer to respond. They put in less effort. They engage when it feels convenient rather than when it's meaningful. And all of it is made possible because your presence fills in the gaps. Your effort compensates for their absence. You become the one stabilizing the connection. So long as that safety net exists, there is no real urgency for them to change. There's no moment that forces them to step up, to question their behavior, or to consider the consequences of their distance. Because from their perspective, the connection is still intact. It may not be deep, it may not be consistent, but it's there, and that's enough to keep things as they are. But the moment you go silent, that entire structure collapses. Your silence is not just the absence of words, it's the absence of reassurance. It's the removal of the one thing that allowed them to stay comfortable in their patterns. And without that, they are left in unfamiliar territory. They check their phone and there's nothing. They expect you to reach out and you don't. They assume the connection is still there and suddenly they're not so sure. And that uncertainty is powerful because for the first time, they are no longer buffered from the consequences of their own behavior. They are no longer protected by your consistency. They are no longer able to rely on your effort to keep the connection alive. And without that safety net, they are forced to confront a reality they've been able to avoid. You might not always be there. This is where 𝗬𝗛𝗢𝗓 begins to shift internally. Not necessarily in a dramatic, immediate way, but in a subtle, persistent way that lingers in their mind. The absence of your voice creates space for questions, for reflection, for awareness. They start to notice the silence in moments where your presence used to exist. And in those moments, they feel something they haven't had to feel before. The weight of your absence. It's important to understand that this isn't about punishing them or trying to make them miss you. Silence, when used as a tactic, loses its power. But when it comes from a place of self-respect, when it's the natural result of you no longer overextending yourself, it carries a different energy entirely. It says, without words, I will no longer do all the work to keep this connection alive. And that message lands more deeply than anything you could explain or argue. Because when you were speaking, when you were reaching out, when you were trying to communicate your needs, they could avoid it. They could deflect, delay, or disengage. But silence doesn't give them anything to push against. It doesn't give them a conversation to escape from. It simply leaves them with themselves. And in that space, the safety net is gone. Now, if they want connection, they have to create it. If they want to understand what's happening, they have to think about it. If they want you in their life, they have to feel the possibility of losing you. And that's where your power lies. Not in what you say, but in what you stop giving so freely. Because the moment your silence replaces your effort, the dynamic changes, not because you forced it to, but because you finally stop protecting them from the consequences of their own distance. When you are constantly pursuing someone, you unintentionally remove the space for curiosity to exist. Everything is already known, already given, already alienable. They don't have to wonder how you feel. They don't have to question your presence. They don't have to think twice about where they stand with you. Your actions answer every question before it even has the chance to form in their mind. And while that might feel like clarity to you, to them it becomes predictability. They know you'll text. They know you'll respond. They know you'll keep trying, even when they don't. So there's no tension, no mystery, no reason for their mind to engage beyond the surface, because curiosity is born in the unknown, not in what is constantly presented and explained. But the moment you stop pursuing, when you pull back your energy, your attention, your effort, you reintroduce something that has been missing from the dynamic uncertainty. And uncertainty is where curiosity lives. Suddenly, the pattern they've grown used to is broken. The rhythm changes. The familiar becomes unfamiliar. And the mind, by nature, seeks to resolve that disruption. It starts asking questions, not because you prompted them to, but because the absence of your usual behavior creates a gap they feel compelled to fill. Why haven't they reached out? Did something change? Are they losing interest? Have I misjudged how they feel? These questions don't arise when everything is being handed to them. They arise when something expected is no longer there. And that's the shift from comfort to curiosity. When you were chasing, they were comfortable. Comfortable in knowing that no matter how little they gave, the connection would continue. Comfortable in staying emotionally distant while still having access to you. Comfortable in a dynamic that required very little from them. But comfort, especially in this context, doesn't inspire deeper thinking. It doesn't push someone to reflect, to evaluate, or to reconsider their behavior. It allows them to stay exactly where they are. Curiosity, on the other hand, pulls them inward. It engages their thoughts. It creates a subtle tension that lingers in their mind throughout the day. They begin to notice your absence in small, unexpected moments. When they would normally hear from you, when they would usually see your name appear, when they would rely on your consistency without even realizing it. And in those moments, your absence becomes louder than your presence ever was. Because now, instead of reacting to your effort, they are thinking about it. This is where something important happens. Their focus shifts from passive reception to active consideration. Instead of simply receiving your attention, they begin to question it. Instead of taking your presence for granted, they start to recognize what it actually meant. And that recognition is not something you can force. It can't be explained into existence. It can't be chased into happening. It only emerges when there is enough space for their mind to engage without interference. By stepping back, you allow that space to form. You allow them to experience what it feels like when you are no longer constantly showing up. And in that experience, curiosity naturally begins to grow. Not because you tried to make it happen, but because the human mind is wired to seek understanding when something changes unexpectedly. But here's the deeper truth. This shift is not about making them chase you. It's about restoring balance. Because when curiosity replaces comfort, the dynamic evens out. They are no longer the ones sitting back while you do all the work. They are now mentally engaged, emotionally aware, and potentially more open to stepping forward. And all of it begins the moment you stop filling every space with your effort and allow them to finally feel what it's like to wonder about you. There is something about absence that reaches places words never can. You can explain your feelings 100 times. You can express your needs with perfect clarity. You can try to make someone understand what you mean to them, what they mean to you, and what the connection could become. But when you are always present, always explaining, always expressing, always available, those words often lose their weight. Not because they are untrue, but because they are constant. And constant presence, no matter how genuine, can become easy to overlook. When you are there every day, when you continue to show up despite inconsistency, despite distance, despite emotional unavailability, the other person doesn't have to imagine life without you. They don't have to consider what your absence would feel like, because they are never required to experience it. Your presence becomes part of their normal, something expected, something assumed, something that doesn't demand deeper thought. But absence disrupts that normal in a way nothing else can. When you step away, when your energy is no longer filling the space, when your voice is no longer present in their daily life, it creates a void. And that void cannot be explained away. It cannot be softened with words. It simply exists, and it demands to be felt. This is where reflection begins, because reflection doesn't happen when everything is still the same. It happens when something changes, when something familiar is suddenly gone. The mind starts to look backward, trying to make sense of what's missing. It replays moments, conversations, patterns. It starts connecting dots that were never examined before. They begin to think about the way you showed up, the consistency you brought, the effort you gave. Things that once felt ordinary now feel significant because they are no longer present. And that's the power of absence. It creates contrast. Without contrast, there is no clarity. When something is always there, it blends into the background. But when it's gone, it stands out in a way that forces attention. It forces awareness. It forces the kind of thinking that presence alone rarely triggers. You see, when you are constantly expressing your value, it can be dismissed, minimized, or even misunderstood. But when your value is removed, when your presence, your energy, your effort are no longer accessible, it becomes something they have to define for themselves. And that process is far more powerful than anything you could have told them. Because now, the realization isn't coming from you, it's coming from within them. They start to ask questions they never asked before. Not because you pushed them to, but because your absence created the conditions for those questions to exist. What did they actually bring into my life? Why does it feel different without them? Did I take something for granted? These are not surface level thoughts. These are deeper reflections that only emerge when someone is left alone with the reality of what they've lost or might be losing. And that's something presence often prevents. Because when you're always there, you cushion the impact of your own importance. You soften the experience of what it means to not have you. You make it easier for them to stay in a state of emotional neutrality, when nothing feels urgent enough to examine. But absence removes that cushion. It exposes the truth in a way that can't be avoided. It creates a space where the only thing left to do is think, feel, and confront what your presence truly meant. And in that space, something begins to shift, not because you said more, but because you finally allowed less to speak louder. When you begin to truly understand self-respect, something fundamental shifts inside you. You stop negotiating with your own worth. You stow. Lowering your standards just to maintain access to someone. And most importantly, you stop confusing persistence with value. Because persistence without boundaries is not strength. It is self-abandonment disguised as effort. At first, people often think that being more patient, more understanding, more forgiving will eventually lead to being chosen. They believe that if they just hold on long enough, explain enough, prove enough, the other person will eventually recognize their worth. But what actually happens in that dynamic is not recognition. It is normalization. The other person becomes accustomed to receiving your effort without needing to reciprocate it at the same level. And over time, that imbalance starts to feel normal to both sides. But self-respect interrupts that pattern. Self-respect is the moment you decide that your presence is not something to be earned through struggle. It is the moment you recognize that your time, your energy, and your emotional availability are not endless resources to be given to anyone who does not value them equally. And once that realization takes hold, something powerful happens. You stop trying to convince people to meet you where you are, and you start paying attention to who naturally does. This shift changes everything because it removes you from the cycle of overgiving. You are no longer constantly adjusting yourself to fit into someone else's emotional limitations. You are no longer shrinking your needs to avoid being too much. You are no longer tolerating inconsistency just to avoid losing potential connection. Instead, you begin to stand firm. And standing firm does not mean being cold or detached. It means being anchored in your own worth. It means Understanding that love, attention, and effort should not require you to repeatedly question your place in someone's life. If you are constantly uncertain, constantly anxious, constantly waiting for them to show up differently, then something is already misaligned. Self-respect allows you to see that misalignment clearly without trying to force it into shape. It also changes the way you respond to emotional inconsistency. Instead of over-explaining your feelings, you start observing behavior. Instead of chasing clarity from someone who is unwilling to give it, you start creating clarity through your own decisions. Instead of trying to prove your importance, you begin to act from the assumption that your importance does not need proving. And this is where your energy becomes fundamentally different. Because people can feel when someone is operating from self-respect rather than desperation. There is no neediness in your presence, no subtle urgency, no hidden fear of being left. There is simply clarity about who you are, what you want, and what you will no longer tolerate. And ironically, that clarity often does what chasing never could. It reveals who is truly aligned with you and who was only comfortable with your overextension. But the deeper transformation is internal. Self-respect frees you from the emotional exhaustion of constantly trying to earn what should have been freely given. It removes the weight of overthinking every interaction, every delay, every inconsistency. It brings you back to yourself, where your peace is not dependent on someone else's behavior. You stop seeing walking away as loss and start seeing it as align me. You stop interpreting silence as rejection and start recognizing it as information. You stop clinging to potential and start responding to reality. And in that space, something quiet but powerful happens. You no longer feel the need to compete for attention that should have been naturally offered. Because the moment you truly embody self-respect, you realize something simple but life-changing. Anything that requires you to abandon yourself in order to keep it was never yours to hold in the first place. There comes a point in emotional growth where you realize something deeply liberating. Not everything that ends is a loss, and not everything that stays is a win. Letting go is often misunderstood as defeat, as if walking away means you failed to hold on tightly enough. But in truth, letting go is one of the highest expressions of emotional maturity because it requires you to choose clarity over confusion and peace over emotional chaos. When you are caught in the cycle of chasing, your entire emotional world becomes centered around someone else's response. Your mood rises and falls based on their attention. Your thoughts become occupied with interpretation. What they meant, why they didn't reply, whether you should try again, whether you should wait a little longer. In that space, your inner stability slowly gets replaced by external dependency. You are no longer anchored in yourself. You are anchored in possibility. But letting go interrupts that dependency. It is not a loud moment. It is often quiet, almost unnoticeable at first. It begins when you stop sending the extra message. When you stop reopening conversations that naturally ended. When you stop stretching your energy to keep something alive that isn't meeting you halfway. And in those small decisions, you begin to reclaim something that was slowly slipping away, your emotional balance. Letting go is not about erasing care. It is about redirecting it back to yourself. You don't suddenly stop feeling, you simply stop feeding what drains you. And that distinction is important because many people believe that moving on requires emotional shutdown. But real letting go is not numbness. It is awareness. It is the recognition that your energy deserves direction, not depletion. And when you begin to let go, something subtle but powerful happens. Your focus shifts. Instead of analyzing their behavior, you start observing your own. Instead of asking why they're inconsistent, you start asking why you are tolerating inconsistency. Instead of hoping they will change, you start noticing how much you have already changed just by trying to hold on. This shift in awareness is the beginning of emotional freedom. Because freedom is not when someone finally gives you what you need. Freedom is when you no longer need them to. The paradox is that when you stop clinging, you start seeing clearly, and what you see is not always what you hoped for. but it is what you needed. You see patterns without distortion. You see effort without imbalance. You see whether the connection is mutual or one-sided, not through emotion, but through truth. And in that clarity, attachment begins to loosen naturally. Not because you forced yourself to stop caring, but because you finally stopped feeding confusion. This is where peace starts to enter, not as a reward, but as a consequence of alignment. You are no longer constantly waiting for messages that dictate your emotional state. You are no longer checking for signs that something might change. You are no longer placing your sense of worth in someone else's inconsistency. Instead, you begin to feel something you may not have felt in a long time. Space. Space to think without anxiety. Space to feel without interruption. Space to exist without emotional tension hanging over you. And in that space, you rediscover parts of yourself that were overshadowed by waiting. Letting go also changes the way you understand connection itself. You begin to realize that anything meaningful does not require constant pursuit. It does not require you to overextend, overexplain, or overgive. Real connection moves with mutual effort, not emotional exhaustion. It grows in clarity, not confusion. And once you see that, you can no longer unsee it. So you stop forcing what is not flowing. You stop reviving what repeatedly fades. You stop calling it love when it repeatedly costs you your peace. Because at that point, letting go is no longer about the other person at all. It becomes about you choosing a life where your emotional stability is not constantly under negotiation. And in that choice, even if nothing around you changes immediately, everything within you already has. Thank you for your time and energy. May you always choose peace, clarity, and self-worth in everything you do. Goodbye for now, and may your journey ahead be guided by strength, growth, and inner freedom.